The question of when and if war is morally justifiable remains a contested issue in modern political philosophy. Today we will be looking at some of the moral arguments made as a justification for war and how they're used and abused. Hi Matt, I hope you're ready for what UAI systems call a complex and nuanced talk on this issue.
You know I always am, even though there isn't a single universally accepted answer to this conundrum.
I think we should start with the three most widely accepted justifications for war and work our way through them.
Sounds good to me. Number one on our list is self-defense, perhaps the most widely accepted moral argument for war. This view contends that a state has a right to defend itself against an armed attack, and therefore war can be a legitimate means to protect its citizens and territory from this violent assault.
That sounds logical. If someone is attacking me, I have the moral right to defend myself.
That's true, John. But some political philosophers argue that national self-defense is a mythical social construct that lacks a strong moral foundation. They question the idea that states have an inherent right to defend themselves with lethal force in the same way individuals do. Since the fog of modern warfare often involves non-state proxies, asymmetrical tactics, and weapons of mass destruction, it makes it difficult to clearly define who or what constitutes a threat to national security. This blurred line makes abuse of the self-defense justification easy, such as starting or expanding the scope of a war. Others advocate for the importance of exploring nonviolent alternatives to war, even in cases of self-defense. They argue that diplomacy, sanctions, and other forms of nonviolent resistance should be prioritized before resorting to lethal force.
It seems that even the concept of national self-defense is more complex than one might think. I suppose that this implies we should draw a clearer line distinguishing between legitimate defense against direct threats and more nebulous preventive or preemptive wars. Let's move on to the next modern moral argument for engaging in war.
The second one on our list is humanitarian intervention. Some political philosophers argue that war can be morally justified to prevent or stop large-scale human rights violations, such as genocide or ethnic cleansing, even if the intervening state is not directly threatened.
I'll wager that this is a more controversial argument, as it raises questions about sovereignty and the potential for abuse.
That's right. Critics argue that humanitarian intervention often violates the principle of state sovereignty, which is a cornerstone of international law. They contend that intervention can undermine the stability of the international system and set dangerous precedents for future conflicts. They'll also point out that intervention can easily escalate into a wider conflict, causing more harm than good. The intervening state may underestimate the complexities of the situation, leading to unintended consequences and prolonged instability and suffering. More cynical critics argue that humanitarian interventions are often selective and driven by hidden political and financial interests, rather than purely humanitarian concerns. This selectivity can undermine the moral legitimacy of intervention and fuel accusations of hypocrisy and corruption.
I suppose that another problem that an intervening state would struggle with is developing effective exit strategies and avoiding protracted conflicts with no clear end in sight.
That's true, John. I'll leave it to our viewers to figure out where in the world this has happened recently. Let's move on to our third justification.
And what is that reason, Matt?
The defense of others is the argument that extends the self-defense principle to include the protection of allies, other non-aligned vulnerable states, and non-state entities, such as ethnic or racial minority groups, from military aggression. The idea is that states have a moral obligation to assist others who are unjustly attacked. As you might expect, this extends to states that have diplomatic agreements for mutual defense, such as NATO. Where it gets sticky is when it gets extended to states and non-state entities that do not have such agreements. One idea that has recently gained attention is the responsibility to protect doctrine that was endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly at the 2005 World Summit. This doctrine emphasized the responsibility of member nations to protect populations from mass atrocities, such as those that occurred in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s.
Like the previous point, I'll guess this idea hasn't worked so well in practice based on what we've seen going on in the world.
That's true. One of the main criticisms is that responsibility to protect has been applied selectively. Some point out this doctrine is often used to target weaker states while ignoring abuses by powerful ones, especially by permanent Security Council members. This perceived double standard undermines the legitimacy and credibility of the doctrine. Some critics also argue that the doctrine can be used as a pretext for military intervention driven by ulterior motives, such as regime change, resource control, or to settle long-running grudges. This can lead to the misuse of the doctrine for geopolitical gains, rather than genuine humanitarian concerns. Others contend that it doesn't provide clear guidelines for when and how to intervene, and ignores nonviolent solutions and favors only military action. This lack of clarity can also hinder effective action and lead to delays or inaction in critical situations. They'll also point out that using a short-term military solution can ignore the root causes of a conflict, such as political oppression or ethnic disputes. Critics also note that implementing the doctrine effectively requires significant resources and political will. In many cases, this has led to underfunded and poorly executed interventions that fail to achieve their intended goals, or don't take place at all.
It does appear that this is one of those policies that looks and sounds good at the diplomatic roundtable but fails in the real world. In my reading on both sides, it seems that some of the old thoughts on justification for war still are present in today's thinking, such as jus ad bellum, the right to go to war, and jus in bello, the right conduct in war.
Yes, for example, most modern political philosophers agree with the basic ideas of just war, as described by St. Augustine up through Clausewitz. Basically, to recap from our previous videos on this topic, a nation shouldn't go to war for the wrong reasons, without authority, without a reasonable expectation of success, and only as a last resort. These historical guidelines also urge that in the conduct of a war, combatants must only attack legitimate targets, that the use of force must be proportionate to the military objective and should not cause excessive harm.
Yet we see those rules discarded often enough, even though most politicians either pay lip service to them or find ways to gloss them over with propaganda.
Indeed. But did you know there are some political philosophers that contend that, in some cases, these uncodified rules should be broken, especially the idea of war as a last resort?
I guess I shouldn't be surprised by that. What are some of their reasons for this line of thought?
There seem to be two basic schools of thought on this. The first holds that in cases where an imminent and overwhelming threat is evident, waiting for all peaceful options to be exhausted could result in catastrophic consequences. Acting preemptively to avert such a threat might be considered morally permissible, even if it doesn't strictly adhere to the last resort principle. They also point out that if peaceful measures have been repeatedly attempted but have proven ineffective in addressing the threat, continuing to pursue them might be futile and even morally irresponsible. In such cases, resorting to military force earlier rather than later could be justified.
It sounds like this opinion is influenced by events like the Pearl Harbor surprise attack, but it also has been used recently in an attempt to provide cover for military actions with geopolitical motivations. What's the other reason?
The other main reason given to move ahead with military action before nonviolent solutions can be reached is to protect vulnerable populations. Some think that in situations where there is an imminent threat of mass violence against civilians, waiting for all peaceful options to fail could result in unacceptable loss of life. Preemptive action to protect those at risk could be considered a moral imperative, even if it deviates from the traditional last resort requirement.
But it appears that both these excuses to dispense with the last resort option have the problems we mentioned, such as ulterior political motivations and unintended consequences.
Yes, of course, they'll say that they are simply arguing for a more nuanced and context-dependent reinterpretation of the classic principles based on modern geopolitical realities. They believe that there have been, and maybe in the future, situations where the moral imperative to prevent grave harm outweighs the requirement to exhaust all nonviolent options.
It seems that a lot of these modern moral justifications for war easily raise concerns about their potential to be misused or manipulated to justify unjust wars. Is it even feasible to apply these principles in complex real-world situations? Should we instead pursue pacifism, which rejects war as inherently immoral? Or should we embrace political realism, which prioritizes national interest and power considerations over any moral concerns? Of course, there are no easy answers to these questions, but I hope that by examining different perspectives, we can gain valuable insights into the difficult ethical dilemmas war presents.
What are your thoughts on the moral justifications for war? When do you think war is justified? Let us know what you think in the comments. We would also appreciate you checking out our other videos on this and other philosophical topics.